Okay, thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks, CIWEM, for giving us this opportunity this evening to present on climate change. We are facing a climate emergency, and now more than ever before, we need to take action. And I've been lucky enough over the last 2 years to be leading on the climate change task at NI Water, working closely with Keith Scott, who heads up NI Water's climate change or climate and business reporting, and Paul Harper, a former director, and also with Anne and her team of climate specialists, as we address this sort of exciting and challenging issue that we face. It's been an important task, and I believe as a business, we've made significant strides in understanding the climate change challenge during this time. So I'm going to share with you now what we've been preparing to tackle climate change by developing a bold strategy. And I'll lead first, and then Ann Cousins will then give an overview then of how she's assisting us move from the strategic planning phase to implementing our climate action plan, which underpins our strategy. So before we go too far in, I just want to give a bit of background on Northern Ireland Water. We were established in 2007. We're a regulated utility, a government company. We're subject to the same form of regulation as happens to other UK water companies. And in Northern Ireland, it's similar to the regulation of gas and electricity, but we have a sole shareholder. This is the Department for Infrastructure, and it's their duty to ensure our company is funded in order to carry out its requirements under the Water Order and Sewerage Services Act. At the moment, the policy is that there's no domestic element to water charging, and that means that we're reliant on the department for funding to cover our costs. We're known as a non-departmental public body. So we produce 6-year business plans called price controls, and we're currently in price control 21, which runs from the 1st of April 2021 to the end of March 2027. Largely unseen, our infrastructure underpins every aspect of life in Northern Ireland. It's the foundation of public health. It can unlock economic growth and help restore the natural environment. And you can see on the slide there some facts and figures associated with our network. Just quickly, on the left, we have source to tap, as we call it. We supply 910,000 households and businesses every day with over 605 million litres of water. And that's produced at 24 water treatment works, distributed through 27,000 kilometres of water main, using 351 pumping stations and a network of service reservoirs as well. And on the right-hand side, we have sink to sea. So we collect the wastewater from over 740,000 homes, and then take it to our treatment works, which we have over 1,000 of, through a network of about 16,500 kilometres of sewer, over 1,300 pumping stations. Once we get to the treatment works, we treat it to a safe standard so it can be released and recycled back into the environment. And we also manage our sludge as well. So why am I telling you all this? Well, I want to convey the scale of our business, and that we have an asset base that's steeped in carbon, plenty of pipes and pumps, and large infrastructure with significant carbon footprints. I also want you to recognise that the value of water, everyone uses it and it quickly disappears down the plug hole or down the toilet. But there's a whole network there to make sure that we treat it and make sure it's safe for return to the environment. And what it means is that we are pumping a lot of water around, whether it's water or wastewater, and water's heavy. A litre of water weighs a kilogram. So as a result, we're Northern Ireland's largest user of electricity. Even though we do try and maximise gravity where we can. So focusing on climate action is not new for NI Water. Since we formed in 2007, we've made some significant improvements in water resilience for customers, developing up water resource plans for many years, and also been working with partners as part of the Living with Water programme, which improves strategic drainage infrastructure in the Greater Belfast area. So we recognise the need really to outline our approach to climate change to support delivery of our corporate strategy, which you can see set out there. You can see our strategic priorities for customer, economy, water, nature, and people. And we recognise the need really to call out an individual or specific strategy on climate change so that we can actually deliver on these 5 strategic priorities. We share the government's vision for infrastructure that enables everyone to lead a healthy, productive and fulfilling life, and which supports sustainable economic development and protects our environment. In February 2020, the Northern Ireland Assembly declared a climate emergency, and on the 6th of June 2022, the Climate Change Bill received royal assent and became the Climate Change Act, NI, in 2022. So this commits Northern Ireland to achieving net zero by 2050, and to the setting of structures to meet these targets, such as climate action plans and a independent climate commissioner. The legislation also introduces requirements for public bodies to report on net zero and climate resilience. So here's NI Water's ambition. So as a company, we set this out to our board in September 2022. It's ambitious in terms of both net zero and our readiness for climate change and resilience that we want to achieve. We're the only water and wastewater utility to set out a climate change strategy that addresses both net zero and resilience. So we want to achieve net zero for energy by 2030 and total net zero for all our emissions by 2040 against the baseline of 2020-2021 emissions. We also want to have a higher state of readiness for climate change, and we're planning for a 2 degrees increase in temperature by 2050 and a 4 degrees rise by 2090. So our strategy has been set out in climate strategy wheels, and our commitments are on the outside, like I just mentioned, net zero energy by 2030 and net zero by 2040. The spokes are clear goals that we will deliver our net zero strategy ambitions. We work through the spokes. We have reduced our energy demand by being more efficient. We want to have a big shift to renewable electricity. We're switching to zero carbon fuels for heating and vehicles on our journey to 2030. And for the longer term, the 2040, it's about recovering energy from our sludge and other resources, finding solutions to process emissions, which is a big issue across the whole water industry. We also want to protect our raw water sources. By protecting them, we need less energy and chemicals to treat water to a potable drinking standard. We're also trying to remove carbon from our construction and the wider supply chain. Hopefully there's low carbon concrete out there, for instance, which can make a big difference in how we construct assets in the future. And we also want to look after our land base. We're the second largest landowner in Northern Ireland, so it's about sustainable management of our land to maximise reduction in emissions from land, and also for it to act as a carbon sink. And as a very last resort, we'll go down the offset route. So we're thinking that this will take about £600 million of new investment over about a 13-year period to reach net zero by 2040. And part of our bold ambition really is to have things like our own wind farm, which will be a key for us to reach net zero by 2030. So what does net zero emissions mean, and how do you get to net zero? Well, there are a variety of greenhouse gas emissions, and not all greenhouse gases are the same. A good start is to convert all gases into a common currency and put them into a relevant bucket. Net zero can be calculated when you add up the CO2 or carbon dioxide equivalents in all those buckets, and you then remove any avoided emissions. And it has to equal zero in simple terms. The greenhouse gases are normalized against carbon dioxide, which allows them to be converted into the common currency. The main greenhouse gases produced by the water industry are nitrous oxides, that's N2O, and that's 265 times more potent than CO2. There's also methane, which is 28 times more potent than CO2 as well. So the buckets we use are called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. Scope 1 emissions are NI Water's direct emissions from our assets and include process emissions from our treatment of wastewater, fuels to heat our buildings, power for our diesel vans, etc. Scope 2, these are indirect energy emissions which are created largely via electricity production, and we purchase to power our plants and assets. Scope 3 are other indirect emissions from our supply chain. We have a carbon-intensive supply chain as we purchase chemicals for our water treatment processes, such as lime, and we use a lot of carbon-intensive materials such as steel and, of course, concrete. However, emissions reductions are possible as we are turning to renewable energy sources such as solar and wind, and we can use our lands to sequestrate and capture carbon through tree planting, and even our soils or peat bogs, if they're in good condition, can sequestrate carbon. So here's Northern Ireland Water's total emissions baseline for 2021, and that's as tons of carbon dioxide based on carbon consumption. So this is our footprint, our baseline at the moment. We reckon there's about 157,755 tonnes across our scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. You'll see in the graph the first bar, which shows our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which are our direct emissions and our electricity, which is our biggest component there. You'll note that the purchased goods and services for scope 3 are particularly large, and this is because it contains the outsourced wastewater treatment works services relating to Omega and Kinniger public-private partnerships that we have. The remaining bars are also scope 3 emissions and relate to capital goods and services, waste generated in our operations, employee commuting and home working, fuel and energy, transportation and distribution, and also some of our leased assets. And that gives us a total emission there of 157,755 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So our carbon footprint or baseline shows all the large bits of carbon that we need to tackle. And the approach that we're adopting is shown in the hierarchy on the right-hand side. And that's the arrow approach. We want to avoid all carbon-intensive activities where possible. We want to reduce, which means we'll improve our efficiency of our activities by reducing emissions. We also want to replace high carbon energy sources with renewables. And as a last resort, we will go down to the offsetting of emissions that cannot be eliminated. Probably should mention bits that we don't have in that baseline are really to do with our process emissions. So the baseline will be modified over time as we get better information, and also better information on our land base. So in this slide set here, I'm sort of presenting the challenge that we have as our emissions will grow as we plan to increase our investment across PC21. And you can see the ambition that we have in the left-hand chart, where we're going from a program for a program from roughly about 150-200 million a year, going up to approximately 500 million for the last 3 years of PC21. So our challenge really is to decouple the CO2 emissions from that investment, and that means really working with a lot of our scope 3 and our supply chain to hopefully break that link. So that's a big challenge that we have over the next few years. So what can we expect in terms of climate change in Northern Ireland, and how are we getting ready for climate change? Well, you can see in the various charts produced from the climate models there that we have increasing temperatures, rainfall, and sea level rise. So conditions will get more extreme. And remember, these are average increases over the period to 2050 and 2090. By 2050, it's expected to experience a temperature increase of between 1.9 degrees C in a medium emission scenario, and 2.4 degrees C in a high emission scenario. And by the 2090s, the temperature is projected to be significantly higher by between 3.3 and 5.2 degrees. Warmer, drier summers can cause a surge in water demand and risk of drought, and intense rainfall and rising sea levels and severe storms can overwhelm our sewers, leading to internal flooding of homes and pollution of watercourses. That puts low-lying sites containing our assets at risk of flooding, which will damage our infrastructure base. So we recognise that other hazards, such as extreme cold, can exist as well, and we're an operator of critical national infrastructure, so we must be ready for all aspects of climate change. So we're moving our business to a higher state of readiness by planning for 2 degrees rise in temperature by 2050, and preparing for 4 degrees rise by 2090. Okay, so how do we manage for this? Well, we've applied the climate change lens and developed this climate wheel so we can be ready for this evolving landscape. And we're targeting each of these areas with the segment goals. And you can see there, promoting water efficiency. We want to increase capacity of our water system. That may be by inserting more service reservoirs or clear water tanks, improving our ability to distribute water around the country. We want to access new sources of water, and this can mean groundwater. We've already got groundwater systems at Moneymore and Lisbon, which we're able to draw on in times of high demand. And also we're driving down leakage, looking at new technologies such as acoustic leakage detection using satellite images and other technologies that are available. In terms of intense rainfall, rising sea levels and severe storms, well, we're trying to keep the stormwater out of our sewers, so there's maximum capacity so they can do the job they're designed to do. We will strengthen our flood and storm defences and also increase resilience of our wastewater systems as well. And also we want to maintain our contingency planning capabilities. And we can't do all this alone. We know we need to work with other agencies out there and collaborate. And this will also, I suppose, reduce the costs of being prepared for climate change as well by acting together. The cost of climate resilience is quite difficult to estimate because there are multiple drivers. This is another challenge that we have. We're developing large strategies such as the Water Resource and Supply Resilience Plan and the Wastewater and Drainage Management Plans, really to give us the necessary detail, and that will eventually translate into costs and opportunities as well to collaborate. It's a slide here. It's one of Anne's that I've sort of pinched or show earlier on, but I just want to really give a flavour of the interdependencies that NI Water has across the whole of the country with other services and other organisations. It's a two-way street sometimes with codependency. For example, NI Water and grid electricity companies, we need their power for our business, but they need our water for cooling. So there's that dependency there. You have other customers down the bottom, if you like, critical care customers and nursing homes that are totally dependent on us for their water supply. And also we've got total reliance on mobile network companies and IT providers and cybersecurity bodies, for their services. So they need to run and be resilient to climate change, to high temperature shocks and the like. But it's a complex picture is what I wanted to paint with that slide. So we're committed to reducing emissions and physical risk through a collaboration with our supply chain partners. The supply chain represents all suppliers, contractors and service providers that are used by NI Water and to build and keep the business operating. It also extends to our partnerships with universities, water industry and other research organisations. We need to work together to see new innovative approaches to reducing emissions and improving resilience. We also recognise the need to provide support and guidance for our suppliers to improve their climate resilience and reduce carbon emissions. And we're working to expand our supply chain mapping and to improve our understanding of the impact of key physical climate risks to our supply chain. I mentioned purchasing goods and services and capital goods and services earlier. Well, NI Water needs to work with the supply chain on achieving net zero and resilience with them. And this may include supporting smaller suppliers and educating them on what's required and building climate change into our frameworks. Some of our supply chain will be far more advanced, so I'm hoping it's a two-way street, and that helps everyone achieve net zero. We definitely can't do this alone. Okay. So going forwards, we need to combine multi-capitals approaching and decision-making into our business. Also, we have the financial sector has provided new guidance and science-based targets, and we have a task force for climate-related financial disclosures. We need to comply with this, or we would risk breaching the company's legislation. So there's a lot of demands now on us, and rightly so, to be able to report our carbon baseline and how we're managing and addressing the climate risk as we go forward. So the climate change strategy, as I mentioned, it fits. It's part of our ambitious set of plans that we have. It fits into our overall strategy to 2046. And where we've got to today has placed us on the front foot with the DERA Climate Action Plan and the carbon budget that came out last year. And also, I say, it meets our TCFD compliance obligations and provides a platform for wider sustainability and compliance, which is important. So here's our strategy status at the moment. It was approved by the board in March 23. We had a soft launch. We were a bit of ahead of the game for government. So we had a soft launch in May 23, and we had some comms, and people may have been aware of it from that. There's some press releases, but we didn't go large on it. Across a directorate delivery team has been set up. We have the necessary dashboards in place and are starting to report up to our executive and board and external stakeholders. We have a dedicated head of climate change in post since October 2023. That's Gerard Carlin, and he's helping to establish the governance structure as we go forward. Should also mention that we're beginning to start our Price Control 27 or PC27 planning, and we need to bring climate change into that. And that will be captured in the social and environmental guidance document that will be created with our shareholder, the Department for Infrastructure. And that will need to contain our net zero and resilience needs. Okay, so as it says there, there's no planet B, and we developed our strategy, and now we're moving forward into the implementation phase, which is key, and we've had support from Arup in addressing our carbon baseline and also looking at climate risk and what it means to our existing assets and their vulnerabilities. So without more ado, I'll hand over to Anne.
Thanks very much, Steve. Really great overview of what you've been up to and where you're at. So hopefully I can request remote control so I don't have to keep saying next slide, please, every few seconds. Yeah, looks like that's working. Wonderful. So just, I guess to recap on what you all know, the reasons that we care about taking climate action, the science is pretty unequivocal these days. We know we need to do something. The public cares about this, and as the customers and citizens that Northern Ireland Water serves, that's pretty important too. And as Steve has talked about, the legislation is forcing us to take action. So just, I guess, to set the context a little bit more. As Steve said, Northern Ireland Water is one of the only water companies in the UK and Ireland that we're aware of that's brought both climate risk and resilience and climate mitigation and decarbonisation together into a single strategy, recognising some of the synergies and trade-offs that need to be borne there. So when we're talking about climate risk and resilience, we're talking about the need to adapt to the impacts of potential extreme weather events over time. And when we're talking about mitigation or decarbonisation, we're talking about reducing emissions to stop those impacts happening in the first place. Next. So we started working with Steve and team in advance of the climate change strategy being released, but then have been working with them since that time to help take the first steps towards more detailed understanding and the first steps towards action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done with them in that time. The work that we've done to date has still very much been focused in this kind of more detailed understanding and planning stage, but that's not to say that Northern Ireland Water is not getting on and implementing projects that are that are both supporting decarbonisation and resilience. I think there's a talk coming up, a CIWEM talk coming up that was announced in the introduction about the battery storage project at Denor, for example, which is an example of that. So I'm going to talk about the work that we supported on in terms of project management, organisational readiness and governance, climate risk and resilience, and decarbonisation. So first up, so on project management, as Steve talked through some of the kind of overarching ambitions for each of the segments of these climate change wheels. So we really worked across the business to work out the first next steps, recognizing that we're not going to have a necessarily immediately a line-by-line action plan as to everything that needs to be done over the next 16 years, but with a focus on the next price control period that Steve talked about. What are some of the immediate things that need to be done to understand and make the case for future investment? We also worked to undertake an organisational readiness review and provide recommendations for the successful embedding of net zero and resilience thinking across the business. So we used a framework set out here to do that, working with stakeholders across the business to understand their readiness and review the effectiveness of existing capabilities, structures and processes, and make recommendations for future development and management practices. And so as a result of that, we made some recommendations about governance, which, as Steve said, are beginning to be implemented now that there's a new head of climate change in post. So next up on climate risk and resilience. What is risk and resilience? I've talked about that, I think, to date. So the work that we have done to date has been portfolio climate risk screening assessment, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. An interdependencies assessment that Steve has previewed for me, and a bit of a review of supply chain in terms of climate risk and resilience. So what are the key climate risks and future extreme weather events that we might see for Northern Ireland water? The things that you would expect largely: flooding, high temperature, low temperature, drought, and wind and storms were those that we looked at. When we're talking about climate risk, we're looking at three key factors. So we're looking at the hazards themselves. So how much hotter will it get? The exposure of particular assets to those hazards. So in what locations will flooding happen, for example? How much hotter will it get in different parts of the country? And then finally, vulnerability to those extreme weather events, which is really about the potential, the sensitivity of those assets to that hazards. So we ended up with, this is just a kind of a selection of the outputs of that work, identifying some assets that we know are vulnerable to particular hazards now, and some that we can see will become more and more vulnerable to hazards in future years. So it might be that Northern Ireland Water doesn't necessarily need to invest now to protect assets that might become vulnerable in the 2050s or 2080s, but it's something that they need to work towards understanding more and spreading out the costs of that adaptation over time, so that we're not putting all of the costs on future generations. As I said, Steve's already previewed this slide on interdependencies, but here we were really looking to understand the potential cascading impacts of climate change risk. So, for example, if a road floods and people can't get to Northern Ireland Water's treatment works to make to carry out maintenance issues, then that has a knock-on negative impact on Northern Ireland Water's ability to supply. And if Northern Ireland Water can't supply water to a hospital that's reliant on water for kidney dialysis machines, then that has the kind of obvious negative impact on people's health and well-being. So that's what that image is trying to show. In terms of supply chain, really important that we're kind of embedding the thinking of this all the way throughout that life cycle of the supply chain. So from thinking about contract development to the actual procurement processes to the implementation of that and the ongoing contract administration. I'm going to try and whiz through decarbonisation in just 5 minutes or so to give you all time to ask questions. So I won't necessarily talk about every last little bit of technical work that we did, because Steve's done a good job of explaining some of it in terms of the baseline work that we did, looking at the kind of inventory of current emissions that Northern Ireland Water has. But we have done a fair bit of work on the kind of greenhouse gas emissions accounting and the data governance around that. Also looking at how climate change reporting that Northern Ireland Water carries out aligns with the Northern Ireland Climate Change Act and reporting that the government does, which can bore you with accounting boundaries at some point if you're really interested, but I won't do that now. I'm going to focus on the decarbonisation scenario planning work that we did, looking at the different options available to achieve the net zero targets set out in the climate change strategy. So decarbonisation trajectories are an illustration of emissions over time. They're estimated using qualitative and, wherever possible, quantitative data inputs. And they're designed to give an indication of the relative change in emissions resulting from strategic decisions that you can make. So really illustrating that what if scenario, and they're aimed to support strategic decision making and exploring a further and preferred approach. So this slide has gone a bit awry in translation somewhere, but we looked at 4 different scenarios for Northern Ireland Water. One looking at business as usual, which had kind of modest grid decarbonisation, modest decarbonisation by other sectors, and really no additional action from Northern Ireland Water. The second one, which you can't see what it's called there, is around delivery of the climate change strategy, taken totally on face value, but not expecting loads of action by others to support Northern Ireland Water in taking action too. A third one, which is really about delivery partnership, recognising what Northern Ireland Water might be able to do if Northern Ireland can work together as one to reduce carbon across Northern Ireland. And the fourth one really looked into some of the more speculative options for carbon removals. So the 4 scenarios look a bit like this. None of them will be easy for Northern Ireland Water. Steve's talked you through the strategy itself. It's very ambitious, but this just serves to demonstrate that without action and support from others across Northern Ireland, that alone will not be enough to achieve net zero for Northern Ireland Water. So yeah, I guess just to recap on Northern Ireland Water's still relatively at the beginning of the journey. The work that we've done to support to date has really been about refining the plan, delving deeper into understanding some of the key issues that Northern Ireland water faces. But there's much more going on simultaneously. Planning doesn't mean you need to stop implementing. So simultaneously, lots of good work going on in the implementation space too. I am going to stop talking there and hand back to Andrew to take some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve and Anne. I'll maybe just start with a question as some of the questions from the viewers come in. So in terms of like the UK water industry, what differences would you say there are in Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK?
Yeah, hi, Andrew. Yeah, I think that the main ones I sort of trying to outline at the beginning is, we're a non-departmental public body, so that means we don't have power over all our ability to invest. Doesn't matter how efficient we are as a company and what profits we make. We pay a dividend to a shareholder, but we can't build up a war chest or anything. We're reliant on what's called capital departmental expenditure limits. So those are set annually, which is very difficult for a large business like us to invest in, complex assets and infrastructure need to be built over several years if you've only got visibility of 12 months of budget at best. So that's one of our main challenges or differences compared to the rest of the UK water utilities. I don't know, Anne, do you want to have a discuss about the Climate Change Act? It's something that's a bit different as well.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the Climate Change Act in Northern Ireland does place specific requirements on reporting for Northern Ireland water, and has gone further than the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee, which means that potentially there's more for Northern Ireland water to do to help compensate for that ambition.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I'll take a couple of questions from the audience here. First one, I'm not sure who wants to take this one. Probably Steve. Is Northern Ireland Water working on installing a metering system for every home to reduce water consumption and alleviate pressure on the wastewater treatment system?
Okay, well, I suppose the answer is no there, but we do have district metering, so across sort of regions, so that we can understand what's going in at a sort of a macro level across our network and monitoring. But so that's a big difference.
Big difference, I was going to say.
If you have meters, you have a wealth of access to data that will tell you where the problems are, the leaks are in your network. So that's why I suppose we're on the back foot compared to maybe the rest of the UK water companies in terms of leakage and
and water consumption we know is higher per capita in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the UK, which as the question says, will have knock-on impacts in terms of the amount of energy used to treat that water and get it into homes and
I suppose it's trying to convince people that water is precious and to be sensible with uses during periods of high demand, because often it can be maybe just a critical period of a few days that we need to get through, if you like. We'll have everything switched on and making the or treating the raw water to a potable standard for distribution. But there are occasions where demand does exceed supply, and then you may well see our tankers going across the country really to try and reinforce or support certain service reservoirs or clear water tanks and maintain supply to some areas. But we are looking at things strategically. We've got the water resource and resilience supply plan, which looks at I think about a 50-year vision ahead and how we can reinforce our networks and move water between catchments, trying to alleviate those issues and making the most of groundwater supplies as well. So that's key. In terms of taking pressure off the wastewater network, it's mainly, I think, to keep the rainwater out is key. It's those big spikes, those big storms that come in. There's lots of impermeable surface area. It runs straight into the storm, and if we've got combined sewers, it flows into our networks and can easily overwhelm them during periods of very high rainfall. So that's our challenge really, is to try and keep the rainwater out of our sewers, and then they can be we can maximize their potential to do the job they're supposed to be doing.
Great, guy. Thank you. Next question then is from Claire. Great talk. Can you say a bit more about how NI Water are using nature-based solutions to build resilience and mitigate climate change as per requirements of the Climate Change Northern Ireland Act?
So in terms of nature-based solutions, I mean, we have been implementing quite a few integrated constructive wetlands. So there's Castle Archdale. I think that was built in PC 15. We've also upgraded the Ballykelly wastewater treatment works, so that's got a large wetland component to it as well, and it's got other sort of sustainability angles there with a solar power system linked to battery storage as well. So I think it can run in the summertime. It can power itself and actually exports to the grid. So that's quite a neat solution there. One of our key case studies. So, and we are being encouraged as well by the regulator to put in green solutions wherever possible. Just need to have the land footprint really to be able to put the greener solutions in. They often take more space, but that's definitely the way forward. And wherever we can, we do build in these integrated constructive wetlands, and we do negotiate with NIEA as well to make sure that we can implement them and stay within our water order consents as well, because the natural systems, they behave in a different way. They may produce more suspended solids at certain times of year, with leaf die off and things like that, and plant die back. So yeah, no, we're working on a multitude of fronts.
Okay, thank you, Steve. There's a comment, and I'll leave that to the end. I'll move on to the next question. So Northern Ireland Water's climate changes allows for different epochs in time, and they seem to be out of line, if you like, with the rest of the UK and Ireland, i.e. that they're comparatively much lower. Are these percentages being reviewed, and is this happening interagency?
I'm not sure that I totally understand the question,
No.
but I think that you're talking about the kind of the impacts of climate change, and the data that we would most frequently use across the UK is data produced by the Met Office called UK Climate Projections 18 or UKCP 18, and that is available in Northern Ireland as it is across the rest of the UK. The data in Ireland is that in the south is not the same, but there's increasingly good data available in the south as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Anne. So a question from John McGuckin. Northern Ireland Water intends to own its own wind farm, was mentioned in the presentation. How would this work in practice, and what other sort of physical infrastructure has been considered?
Okay, well, this, I suppose, is a bold idea at the moment. We would need to have funding from a source outside of our standard price control arrangements. So so we would be looking to I suppose Department of Economy for initiatives like that. But yeah, it's we've got the ideas, we've got a large land base. I think it's
you're working through a business case, aren't you,
we
on
are
that at the moment? I believe, just to which will in its very approach consider other options, which are probably more about alternatives that involve getting the energy from elsewhere and having less control over NI Water's own supply, which I guess is one of the benefits that your own wind farm happens with. I guess in practice it might be a direct wire or a PPA agreement, or a virtual version of that to provide that energy to where it's needed.
That's great, guys. That seems to be all the questions from the audience. I'll just ask you one last one, and I'll let you go. So you mentioned the original target of 2030 to be net zero for energy by 2030. What pressures do you think might affect those two targets you have for 2030 and 2040?
Well, I suppose it will be opportunities to progress a wind farm or a large solution, and funding would be the big issue for us. And we would need to, I suppose there are a lot of uncertainties at the moment. We're obviously very keen to hear the result of NI executive deliberations, if you like, on funding. But there's no official source of funding for climate change initiatives as such in PC21. So it's a bit of a gap there. So that needs to be plugged. But that is a pressure on us. We have got a grand plan to put a lot of investment in to address things like development constraints and flooding and issues like that. But it's uncertainty of that funding, and also the solutions we need to be innovative and do things in a different way. We can't just build large concrete tanks, for instance. So we have to look at more sustainable solutions to slow the flow or divert new suds.
That's really some of the kind of the benefits of thinking about mitigation and adaptation together, right, Steve? The solutions to preparing for future climate change are not all about building more concrete and increasing the embodied emissions associated with that.
It's whole of catchment type solutions, isn't it? Large scale and a lot of collaboration with lots of partners. Working closely with councils and maybe other organisations that are landholders as well, so that we can drive things in the right direction. Even like improving your understanding and ability to improve our peatlands. We are working on the Garum Plateau and re-wetting peat and things there for biodiversity benefits, as well as hopefully sequestration of carbon dioxide. So if we treat our land right, as and other landowners across Ireland, there's no reason to think why the peatlands can't be big sequestrators of carbon from the atmosphere, which would be a massive bonus for us.
The two other challenges, I think, are probably around scope 3 emissions in your supply chain, being a big one, and the need for everybody else to work with you. And the second one is what the next question is about, around process emissions, which obviously we're starting to see technologies trialed to mitigate those, and there's remains some uncertainty in the carbon factors used to assess process emissions, with the IPCC's estimate being about 4 times more than that currently used by water companies in their carbon accounting workbook. There isn't a resolution to that yet. There's ongoing work across UCWER, the Water Industry Research Group. ARUP, we're currently doing a piece of work for the Committee on Climate Change to look at embedding wastewater pathways and understanding those process emissions into the next carbon budget for across the UK. So there's ongoing work to try and resolve that challenge.
Yeah, and there's also we're developing an emissions model as well for our wastewater treatment processes. So that's with another consultant, Anne. But so there are lots of initiatives going on.
Yeah,
and I think that's going to be, I think that's quite leading or cutting edge. So we are looking at this. It is a huge problem. or an issue, and we've got to understand it more. So we're making steps in that direction, so which is positive.
Okay. I think we've run out of time, guys, for any further questions. So thanks to Steve and Anne again for that. It was a brilliant, fascinating and insightful presentation and discussion there at the end. So thank you to you both again. I think it certainly will be a challenge to relish meeting those targets over the next 10 to 20 years, but I think the consequences of not doing it cannot be ignored. So we just have to start and make headway into it. So thank you again. And I'd also like to thank the CIWEM Northern Ireland branch committee, and to Barbara as well in CIWEM head office for helping us to facilitate this event and organising it. Last but not least, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in tonight, and hope to see you all again at our upcoming events. And I think we'll bring close to this evening's webinar there, unless Barbara, you have anything you'd like to add?
I'd just like to thank the Northern Ireland branch for organising this, and to our speakers. Really interesting and thought-provoking initiatives there, and we look forward to seeing you at other webinars. And you've got one on the 9th of May, which is on the battery, Dunor battery?
Dunor battery project,
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks
Have
a
a good
lot.
evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Cheers.